In this section, we'll cover the concept of methods, including parameters and arguments, in a little bit more depth. In this lesson, I want to focus on the idea of methods without arguments, so methods that can be invoked entirely by themselves. As a reminder, a method is simply an action that can be performed on an object. A method tells the object to do something. Now, some methods accept what we call inputs. Inputs help modify how that method is going to operate. The names that we give to the inputs are called parameters, and the actual values that we pass to the inputs whenever we call a method are called arguments. So let's go ahead and take a look at some methods that are available across a wide variety of VBA objects, and these methods do not take any arguments, so they can function entirely independently by themselves. We begin with the workbooks collection object. Let's take a look at workbooks, and I'm going to execute all this code in the immediate window rather than in a procedure because these are all, again, simple one-line pieces of code. So on the workbooks collection object, which collects all of the workbook objects in the current Excel instance, there is a method called add. The add method does not take any arguments, it does not take any inputs, it can function entirely autonomously by itself, and the add method creates a brand new workbook. So when I execute this, a new workbook is going to pop up. There it is on the left side. Simple, clean method invocation. Let me go ahead and close this. Let's take a look at a couple other objects and a couple other methods that do not require any arguments. Another option available to us. Let's take a look at a single workbook object. So if I reference the workbooks collection object and take out the only workbook I have open, which is present on my left side, on a specific workbook object, I have a method called save, which saves the workbook. Now, in order to save a workbook, we actually need to make some changes. So right here on the left side, I'm just going to write in some random values here. Let's just put 1, 2, 3. Doesn't really matter. Here we've written in a value into cell A1, and now we can see on the top here on the pane it says methods without arguments, and the saved keyword does not appear, which means this current change to the workbook has not been preserved. But now in my immediate window, I can add on the save method, execute with my enter key, and now we can see at the top pane right here, saved appears because now the change has been preserved. So save is another method. It's available on a workbook object, but again, it is a method without arguments. The important part of this lesson is not to memorize all these methods because we're going to dive into them over and over again throughout the course. The key takeaway here rather is the fact that not all methods require inputs. Some of them can function entirely by themselves. The last method that I want to show you here is the clear method on a range. Conveniently, we have a range here in cell A1 that has a value in it, so I can reference it with range A1. And on a range, I have a method called clear. Clear predictably clears the entire contents of the cell, and that's more than just the text value. It's also the formatting, the borders, everything inside of it, so it returns it back to its original state. So when I execute this method, which doesn't take any arguments, cell A1 is now going to be cleared. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. Throughout this entire section, we're going to be diving into methods in a little bit more depth. In this lesson, I just wanted to cover the idea that methods do not necessarily have to take arguments. Some of them can function by themselves. And in the next lesson, we'll take a look at methods that do take arguments. In this lesson, we'll explore methods that accept arguments. As we know, arguments are inputs to a method that modify how that method operates. We saw an example of this earlier with MessageBox, which has a prompt parameter to which we provide an argument that reflects what it is that's actually going to be output in the message box. So some methods have arguments, some do not. And for those methods that do, some of those arguments are mandatory or required, while some of them are optional. Whenever we're feeding arguments to a method, we can feed them in one of two ways. We can either feed them sequentially in the order in which they're expected, or we can feed them alongside their parameter names, which allows us to have a little bit more freedom with how we structure our arguments. We're going to take a look at that syntax in this lesson. In addition to that, we're also going to explore the online VBA documentation. There's a lot of moving pieces to the Excel object model. There's hundreds of different objects that are available there, and there's no way that a single course or a single VBA textbook can possibly cover them all. So there's going to come a point in your journey as a VBA developer where you're going to have to look this stuff up yourself. You're going to have to explore the documentation, look for the right method, and explore its documentation page to see how it operates. And we're going to take a look at how we can do that in this lesson. So let's say a coworker comes to you and says, hey, I heard there's this functionality in VBA, there's this protect method that's available on a worksheet object, and what protect can do for us is enable password protection such that the user will not be able to enter any values into a worksheet or modify it at all unless they enter the proper password. So you might go to something like the immediate window and say, okay, well, I have my worksheets collection object. I can pull out some random worksheet object like sheet 1, and I'm going to type in protect and put a space. And for some reason, VBA is not going to offer us some help. Maybe there's a bug in the program, maybe we mistyped something. So we're not getting that IntelliSense feature showing up that's telling us exactly what our options are or arguments or inputs are for this protect method. So what can we do in this case? Well, we can head online to the online VBA documentation. So here I have a web browser open to Google. And so we can search for something like VBA worksheet object. We're going to see this very first result. It says worksheet object. That's exactly what we're looking for. And this is going to take us to Microsoft's official documentation page for VBA. So here we can see we have the name of the object listed above, and there's a page for every single object in the Excel object model. In fact, here on the left-hand side of this page, we have all of the objects that are available in the object model. So as I scroll down, we can see it's quite an extensive list. Right here at the top of this page, I also have a brief description of what the object actually is, what it represents. So here it says the worksheet object is a member of the worksheets collection. The worksheets collection contains all the worksheet objects in a workbook. So in case you've forgotten that, you can get help with that here. The most important part of this page, in addition to the examples we see, is when we scroll down a bit, after the events section, which we'll dive into later, we have a list of all of the methods as well as all of the properties that are available on that specific object. So let's explore the protect method, which we were just searching for a moment ago. Here it's listed under the list of methods. So when I go to this page, we're going to get a brand new page for each method. That there exists a page for every single property and method. And right here, we're going to get a brief description of what it does. It protects a worksheet so that it cannot be modified. That makes sense. Sometimes the name like this is pretty self-explanatory, but it's not always. So that's really helpful to have. Right below here, we're going to get exactly what we were looking to get in the immediate window, which is the method name followed by all of the expected parameters. So here they are: password, drawing objects, content, scenarios, etc. This method actually takes quite a large number of parameters. How do we find out what each of them do? Well, of course, we have this section called parameters where we can scroll down, and this is the most helpful part of the page because the parameters are going to be listed in the order in which they're expected. So here is password, which is the very first expected parameter. Right here, this column is going to tell us that it's an optional argument. We don't have to provide it. The method called will function if we do not include it. Right here, the data type is going to tell us what kind of data the argument is expected to have. So sometimes it may be an integer or a whole number. Sometimes it may be a string. This variant, which we'll dive into later, means essentially any data type will work. So this column here is going to tell us what kind of data type each argument is expected to be like, the actual format. And then here on the final column on the right, we're actually going to get a description of what that argument should be. So the password parameter should be a string that specifies a case-sensitive password for the worksheet or workbook. All right, so that makes a little bit of sense. So we can apply this principle back to our actual code. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor right here. And now we know that the very first parameter to protect is password. And whenever we're feeding arguments in, we can either feed them sequentially or explicitly specify the parameter that they're being applied to. Let's take a look at both scenarios first. The first option for us is to simply enter the argument. What VBA is going to do is say, okay, there's one argument you're passing in. I'm going to assume that you're tying it with the very first parameter expected, which is password. So if we provide a second argument, that second argument is going to go to the second expected parameter, and the third argument will go to the third expected parameter, and so on. So this will work. When I execute this, we're going to add some protection to the worksheet. So when I, let's say, click into a cell and try entering a value like 5, we're going to get this big pop-up. The cell or chart you're trying to change is on a protected sheet. Okay, to make a change, unprotect the sheet. Okay, so everything worked. So this is all functional. So this syntax makes everything work great. Let's take a look at the other way that we can write this as well. In addition to feeding the arguments in sequentially, what we can do is write the parameter name out first. So the parameter name, or the name of the expected input here, is called password. And then the way we assign an argument to a parameter is with a special syntax. It's going to be a colon symbol followed by an equal sign. and to the right of that we actually give the argument. So the argument to the password parameter is going to be top secret, let's say. That's, again, an arbitrary string. So this syntax is identical to the one that we just saw before. The advantage with this approach is because we are writing the parameter name out explicitly, VBA can figure out what it is that we're tying together, what arguments go with what parameters, which means that we can feed our arguments in non-sequential order, and we can also skip certain parameters. So if we wanted to move on to, let's say, the parameter that would normally be expected in the 5th position, we can now just put a comma and write that 5th position parameter out and then assign it its proper argument. The associations here are being created by name, not by order. So we no longer have to keep them in order, and we no longer have to feed them sequentially. So whatever approach you prefer is up to you. This approach is obviously a lot safer and a lot more stable, and I also prefer it because it's a bit more explicit. If somebody just writes a string of top secret, we may not have an intuitive sense of what that actually refers to. Now we have a little bit better understanding because the code says the parameter name is password, and a user can probably infer that that means the actual password that's going to protect the worksheet. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. It's not really important here to memorize the protect method. That wasn't the point of this lesson. The goal here is to figure out how to use online documentation to find what we're looking for. Remember, sometimes you're going to run into an unfamiliar method or property or even an unfamiliar object, and you may have to dive into the documentation to find more information for what you're looking for. Whenever you stumble upon a method page, you're going to see a list of all of the expected parameters. Parameters, again, are the names that we give to the inputs that a method can accept. Some of those parameters are optional, some of them are mandatory. It depends on what object we're dealing with. When it comes time to actually invoke the method and pass it arguments for those parameters, there are two ways we can do that. The first way is to pass those arguments sequentially. They're going to be tied to the corresponding parameter in the same position. And the second way to do it is to actually write the parameter name explicitly out as we did here. That allows us to pass the arguments in any order we want, which buys us a bit more flexibility and stability. In this lesson, we'll explore the concept of methods that accept multiple arguments. So in the previous challenge, we used the open method on the workbooks object with only the first argument, file name. We did that so that we could open a file. And we did it sort of with the default set of options or configurations. But the open method actually accepts multiple arguments. It has multiple parameters, multiple inputs that it can accept, and we can provide different values to more than one parameter in order to customize how that method operates. Whenever we're feeding multiple arguments to a method invocation, we need to separate them by a comma. Now there's a couple ways that we can do that, and we're going to take a look at that in this lesson. The first thing to note here is for the purposes of this lesson, I've created a new Excel workbook file in the same directory as the current file I have here. So my other file is called some random file. It doesn't contain any important content. It's just there so that we can open it, but it's not actually important. You can open whatever file you want. So in this file, which is called methods with multiple arguments, this is where I'm actually going to be writing the VBA code to open some random file. I'm going to be doing that in my immediate window. So let's begin with the workbooks open method. So workbooks, we're going to put a dot, we're going to use the open method, and then when I put a space here, we're going to see the documentation for that method. So we can see here the very first argument is the file name as a string. So it's expecting a string in double quotes that's going to represent the file name that we want to open. So we can write something like some random file.xlsx. And this will work. This is what we did in the assignment. We just fed it as the first argument. Because the arguments are fed sequentially, VBA is able to identify that some random file.xlsx is a string argument to provide to the file name parameter. But what if we want to provide another parameter? For example, the third parameter that we have here in line is called read only. That expects an argument of either true or a false. That's something called a Boolean value, which we'll dive into a little bit later. But that essentially allows us to set whether that file is only going to be readable, which means that the user can't actually edit it. What if we want to use that read-only parameter, which is third in line? How can we do that? The first thing we can do is to provide the parameter names explicitly, and that allows us to actually skip arguments. We don't have to provide them sequentially. We can skip over them because VBA will be able to tie our arguments to their proper parameters with the association. So how can we do that? Well, we can do that right here by writing file name :equals. So this is the assignment syntax of an argument to a parameter name. This is the explicit way of saying when we give a string of some random file.xlsx, we want that argument to correspond to the parameter of file name. Now, file name here is first in line, so it's convenient, but this is more helpful when we actually want to feed a parameter that is not in order. So if I put a comma here, you can see the second parameter that it's actually expecting here is called update links, but that's not the one that we actually want to target. We want to target read only, and I can skip over parameters if I write them out explicitly. So instead of writing update links, I can target the read only parameter, give that a colon equals to assign it an actual value, and you can ignore this syntax right now, but it's going to be a value of true. So this is going to give an argument of true, which is going to make that workbook readable and not writable. So again, the functionality of the open method isn't changing. It's still opening a workbook, right? The core heart of the method hasn't changed, but now with the additional parameters and the additional arguments or the additional inputs, we're modifying how that method operates. So let me go ahead and execute this with the enter key. You can see here is the workbook. It's been opened, and right here is some random file. It's opened everything properly, and if I try to enter text, it should prohibit us from writing. It looks like it's not, but right here it says read only. So if I attempt to save this, there we go. So now it's saying we can't save some random file because the file is read only. So it looks like read only allows us to enter text, but we can't actually make changes or save changes to the file. So everything is working as expected, as our VBA code was designed to do. So let's not save this. I'm not sure even how we can. I'm sure it just would not allow us. So let's click the don't save. That brings us back here. So what can we do if we wanted to feed the arguments sequentially rather than writing the parameter names out explicitly? So let me go back to our original method invocation. So we can see file name is first and read only is third. Well, if we're going to be writing the names out explicitly, then we can feed them non-sequentially. But unfortunately, if we're just going to be feeding them kind of numerically in line, we do have to place commas to represent even those parameters that we're going to be skipping. So for example, I know that some random file .xlsx is going to be our first argument, but when I put a comma here, you can see VBA wants to move to update links, but we don't actually want to provide anything to that. So what we have to do here is just put another comma so that it skips ahead to the next parameter in line. And now, since this is focused on read only, we can provide the same argument of true. So this syntax is a little bit lighter, it's a little bit shorter, but I don't like it so much because it's a little bit dirtier. We have two commas in a row, and we're not exactly sure what true means. We may forget what this method does, and we may not be sure about what true is corresponding to, what parameter it is affecting. So even though this will work, I can press enter and we're going to get the exact same result. I really prefer the first approach of writing out any parameter names explicitly along with their given arguments. It may take you a little bit more time, but it'll reinforce in your head what it is exactly that the method is doing and what it is that you're customizing. With that said, if you're only giving a method one argument, for example, if we only wanted to feed that first argument, which is file name, in cases like this, I don't write the parameter name out explicitly because I think it's kind of intuitive. When we're calling the open method, it sort of makes sense to me that the first thing we need to tell it is what's the actual file that we're going to open. But it really is a matter of personal preference whether you want to write your parameter names out each time or feed them sequentially. It really is up to the developer and how you process these things best. There is, I think, a good middle ground, a good balance that you can strike between keeping things simple and keeping things well written out so you understand what it's doing. But you'll pick up that skill over time as you write more code. It's not really something that is teachable. It just comes with experience and practice. But that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked about VBA methods that accept multiple arguments. Whenever you have multiple arguments that you're feeding or multiple inputs, you have to separate them with a comma. We can either provide the parameter names explicitly, and that way we can skip certain parameters, or if we're feeding them sequentially, that allows us to save a little bit of space by not writing the parameter name, but then we do have to put fake commas essentially whenever we're going to be skipping a parameter. That's all there's to cover here. I'll see you in the next lesson. All right, so we've previously explored the online documentation for VBA objects, including their properties and methods. And in this lesson, I'm going to show you a lightweight documentation tool that's built directly into the Visual Basic Editor, and it's called the Object Browser. There's two ways that we can access the Object Browser. The first way is to click the View menu up top and select Object Browser, and when it pops up, it's going to occupy the place that's normally taken up by the code window, so here it is. And I'm just going to exit out of it here by clicking the Close Window button at the top right. The second is to use the keyboard shortcut, which is F2. That's going to bring up the Object Browser as well. Now, the object browser lists every object, property, and method across all Microsoft applications. So we're not actually limited to searching strictly within the Excel object model. We can look across the object model for essentially any Office application. So right here, I have a couple of results showing up, but let's go to the starting place for this object browser. So let me just get rid of my search term here. When you launch this browser for the first time, what you should see is that this is going to select all libraries. All libraries essentially means all Microsoft applications. So if you only want to target Excel and its object model, you want to make sure to select this Excel option right here. That's going to limit the search range. Now in here, in this second box below, this is where we type in whatever we want to search for. And this can be anything from an object to a method to a property. So let's say I want to search for the worksheets object, which we're all pretty familiar with by now. So when I type worksheets and press enter, or press the binoculars right here to the right, that's the same thing as searching, we're going to see a list of anywhere where that worksheets search phrase is going to appear. The very first result is actually going to find worksheets for us. This is the actual object itself. So for example, the second result is actually listing the application object, and it's telling us that it has a property or a member called worksheets, which of course is also the same thing as the worksheets object. But the search results are going to include anything, whether it's the object itself or whether it's a property on another object that represents that object that we're searching for. So we want the top result here. This is our worksheets object. And right here on the left, it's also going to appear here as the selected term right here in this classes panel. So once we select worksheets here, what we're going to get here on the right is a list of all of the properties and the methods that are available on that object. There's a couple weird symbols here, but you'll quickly commit them to memory if you use the object browser a lot. The first is, of course, this green flying book thing. This essentially means that the member that is being listed here is a method. So what I mean by member is just something that belongs to that object. So a member is kind of the parent category that includes both properties and methods. Both properties and methods are members of a given object. So the green flying book demonstrates that the current selection is a method. So for example, add is a method, copy is a method, delete is a method on the worksheets object. And anything with this hand plus the index card represents a property. So count is a property, creator is a property, and so on. And whenever we select any of these, we can actually see a little bit of information down below. For example, count is going to say it's a property, as well as the what kind of data type it is. So a long here represents a whole number data type. Now, it's not actually giving us a lot of information about what this property is doing. We're going to have to refer to the online documentation to get that. And there's two ways that we can do that. The first is once a property is selected on an object or a method for that matter, we can select this yellow question mark. And once we click it, it's going to launch a web browser that's going to take us to the documentation page for that specific property or method. So it's a really quick way to navigate to what it is that we're searching for. So on worksheets, the count property, that's the page that's going to load now. It should be opening the default web browser that you have selected on your computer. Here we're getting the documentation for the worksheets count property. It returns a long value that represents the number of objects in the collection. Makes sense. The other way to do the exact same operation is to use the keyboard shortcut F1. F1 is again going to open up a browser and load the page for that documentation. Let me just show you another example with a method. So let's say I want to find out what the delete method on the worksheets object does. Just select it with the mouse, press F1. A browser is going to open and load the proper page with that documentation. Unfortunately, if you actually need to find out what a property or a method is doing, you are going to have to refer to this online site. But the object browser is kind of a good introduction in case you want to search for something without leaving the confines of Excel, especially if you don't have an internet connection. You can sort of get a list, even if you look at some of the methods here. Even if we take a look at something like delete, or perhaps add as a better example, we can actually see some of the parameters and arguments that are available here, what their names are, so we can sometimes get a sense of how a method operates or what it does, even if we don't have an explicit text documentation for what it is. But that is the object browser. It's built into the VBE. You can use it at any time. Just press F2 to bring it up. You can search within the Excel object model for anything you want. We can search for application. We can search for worksheets, workbooks, any object at all. It's going to appear here. Make sure you select it. Here we're going to have all the members of that object. The members include both the properties and the methods. We can select any one of those, have a brief description here, and then use that by pressing the F1 key to access the online documentation for that member. That's all there is to cover here. I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at all the ways that we can execute or invoke a procedure from both the Visual Basic Editor and the main Excel interface. I'll begin here by defining a very simple procedure. It's not going to do much of anything, just put up a message box for us to observe. So let's call the procedure annoy user, and I'm going to put a message box here that says, you ran the macro. All right, let's begin with the stuff that we already know how to do. So in order to run this macro from the Visual Basic Editor, we can press this green play button. That's our first option. This macro is going to run. Here's the pop-up box. Perfect. The keyboard shortcut for this green play button is the button F5 on your keyboard. That's a very, very quick way to run the macro as well. What about on the main Excel interface? Well, as we know, in the Developer tab, we have this button called Macros. When we click that, we're going to get a list of all of the macros that are public, which means accessible to the user in the main Excel interface. And by default, all the macros we write are going to be public. We're going to talk about how to make them private a little bit later in the course. But here is our single annoy user macro. We can just click run to run it. There, the macro runs again. As another shortcut, if you want to bring up this box, the keyboard shortcut for that is going to be Alt plus F8. That allows us to get really quick access to all of our macros. We can execute it again. Perfect. Here's a couple more ways that we can run a macro from the Excel interface. The first option is to assign the macro to something called the Quick Access Toolbar. That's this little toolbar that's found at the very top of Excel. It has common features like save and undo. If we click this little drop down to the right, we have this option here called More Commands. This will allow us to actually customize and put more commands on the Quick Access Toolbar. Here on the top, instead of choosing from popular commands, we want to select this drop down and find the macros option. So here we have a list of our macros, including the one we just wrote, annoy user. Here on the right, we have all of the current icons or actions on the Quick Access Toolbar, like auto save, save, undo, redo. So in order to bring this one over here, we just click this add button. It's going to show up here at the end of the list. We can, of course, move it around if we want it to appear elsewhere. Let's just leave it at the end for now. When I click OK, it's going to show up here with this default icon. So here it is. When I hover my mouse over it, it even tells me that it's called annoy user. So I can click here, and it's going to pop up the box as expected. As a little bit of a heads up, if we click this drop down again, there is an option available for the Quick Access Toolbar called Show Below the Ribbon. What that's going to do is move the QAT, as it's called, from the top to right below the main Excel ribbon. The reason a lot of developers prefer this option is because it gives you a whole lot of space to the right here where we can put a whole bunch of macros. It just buys you more space in general. So if you want to have a lot of macros that you can just click here and assign each one a different icon, you can move the Quick Access Toolbar to the bar below the ribbon. To bring it back, you can just click this drop down and click Show Above the Ribbon, brings it back to right here. We can also assign the macro to something called a form control, which is basically just like a button in the Excel interface. Here in the Developer tab under Insert, we're going to have a whole bunch of form controls listed here, and the one we're primarily going to want to use here is this button. So once I click this, I'm going to get this cursor on screen, and I can click and drag it to shape the size of the button. And once I let go, we're going to get a pop-up box that's going to ask us to assign a macro to the button that we're about to create. So I'm going to choose the macro that I want to assign to the button. So I'm going to click on Annoy User, click OK, and now we have this button. Right now it says button 2, but we can go ahead and edit the text in it, say something like Annoy User. Let's give it a name. It doesn't have to be the same name, by the way, as the macro. We can give it something like Annoy User. And then as soon as we click out, the button's actually going to be activated. So when I hover my mouse over it, I'm going to get this little pointer finger. When I click on it, there we go. Our macro is running. You ran the macro. All right. So obviously this is all very silly because all our macro is doing is performing some kind of operation of output with the message box. But you can imagine if you're building some kind of complex macro that does things with multiple spreadsheets and workbooks and adds formatting and fonts and stylings, it's a lot easier to have the user click a button like this and have a whole variety of buttons listed to the right, like a whole menu of options, compared to having to go to the macros box and find the right macro and execute them all manually. So hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how we can even customize the Excel interface to make the experience of running a macro much more seamless and easy for an Excel user. Finally, another way that we can execute our macro is by assigning it directly to a button on our ribbon. In fact, we can customize our ribbon completely, including creating new tabs and new groups of commands. So here's what I can do. I'm going to hover my mouse anywhere on the ribbon, and if I right click, I'm going to have an option available here called Customize the Ribbon. If I click that, that's going to bring up this Excel options dialog box. And on the right here, we have a list of all of our tabs. Here we have the developer tab, which we enabled at the beginning of the course. What I can do here is click New Tab. That's going to create a new tab right here and a new group within it. What I'm going to do is just select the new tab that's been created. I want to give it a new name, so I'm going to rename it, and let's just call it Macros. All right, here we have a new group, and what I can do here is actually add my macro to that group. So underneath this choose commands from option, I'm going to right click that or left click that and take a look here for macros. Once again, we want to filter for just the macros that are available. So here we have our macro. It's called annoy user. So we can select it right here and add it. That's going to add it underneath that new group that's been created within the macros tab. In fact, we can also change the name of the group. So let's change the name of the group by clicking that and clicking rename. In fact, it looks like we can also assign it a different, an icon. So let's go ahead and give it an icon of something like an unhappy face. Why not? And let's just call it annoyance, because that's what this macro group is going to do. So, okay. So our group is called annoyance. Our macro here is called annoy user. I'm curious if I click rename here, if we're going to be able to, yep, we are able to now actually select an icon for that macro that is different from the default one that we see. So let's go ahead and select something funny here. Let's do a smiley face. All right, so I'm going to click OK. Perfect. So we now have a new tab called macros, a new group called annoyance. The macro annoy user is going to be represented by a smiley face. So I can click OK. Right here on my ribbon, we can see macros has appeared to the right of the developer tab. We can also, by the way, modify where it's going to appear in the ribbon. Doesn't really matter for this lesson. So we can click on macros. Right here we have our annoyance group, and here we have our wonderful annoy user macro. If I click this, you can see the code is being executed just like always. So here we go, you ran the macro. I think I definitely saved the best for last because this is my favorite way to run a macro in Excel. It's definitely the most cleanest, most elegant, and I think that it really blends well with the actual Excel experience. It looks just like a regular ribbon, and you can customize and group your macros together based on what they do. You can have, for example, a formatting group, a worksheets group, a font group, whatever you want. But in this lesson, we talked about the different ways that we can execute a macro, both from within the Visual Basic Editor and from the Excel interface. We can always run it with the play button, with the F5 command. We can assign a macro to a form control like a button. We can assign a macro to the quick access toolbar, also called the QAT. And finally, we can assign a macro to the ribbon as well. Lots of different options available for you to utilize. Choose whatever works best for you and your business needs. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the TypeName method. The TypeName method accepts a VBA object as its only argument, and it returns the type of the object as a string. I'd like to begin here with a little bit of a review. As you may recall from the lesson on message boxes, VBA includes an object that's actually called VBA, and that object packages a lot of utility functions. Utility functions are just little snippets of code that help us as developers be more efficient and productive. Message box is an example of a method that's actually on the VBA object. Now, the way it works is, to simplify things, VBA is able to look up those methods on the VBA object, so we don't actually have to include the VBA prefix. As an example, we could write VBA.messageBox, and that's totally valid syntax, but we can also write messageBox by itself, and it's going to know what it is that we're talking about. Well, TypeName is a method that is also available on the actual VBA object. So if I type TypeName, we're going to see that method right here. So let's take a look at how this method works in action. What I'm going to do here is just place a question mark at the beginning because we are asking a question here. We're not issuing a command. And this method, again, accepts as its argument a valid VBA object. So let's begin at the top of our object model with application. And what it's actually going to do is return to us the type of the object as a string. So what we're about to see here is not going to be that climactic. We're actually going to get application. And just to prove to you that the VBA object is not needed, I'm just going to put TypeName right here without the VBA prefix, also put an application, and we're going to get the exact same result. All right, so right now this doesn't seem that cool because, well, it's kind of obvious if we're giving it application, we're going to get back application. The real use of this, however, comes whenever we're going to be dealing with dynamic data that we can't predict in advance. For example, later on in the course, we'll talk about this idea of user forms, which is essentially a dialog box that we can create that the Excel user can interact with. And let's say we have some kind of option where the user can either select a workbook from a list or a worksheet from a list. In that kind of scenario, whenever we want to perform some kind of conditional logic, which means if they select a workbook, do this, and if they select a worksheet, do this, in that kind of scenario, something like this might be really great. This is really ideal for scenarios where you might not know the exact kind of object that you're going to be working with, and you might want to take different steps depending on what the object is. So how can you figure out what the object is? Well, you can pass it in to something like TypeName, and it will tell you. And then you could write a piece of logic that says, hey, if TypeName of this object is workbook, take the steps necessary for dealing with the workbook. And if TypeName for this object returns worksheet instead, take these steps to deal with a worksheet. So right now it's a little bit underwhelming, but I did want to make sure that you understood how this method works. So let's take a look at a couple more examples here in the immediate window. Here's a tricky one for you. What happens if I do this? TypeName, and I'm going to enter application. But notice that I'm going to wrap it in double quotes. What's actually going to happen here is I'm going to get a string. What this method expects is a valid VBA object, and this right here is not the application at the top of our hierarchy. This is simply a string with 10 or so characters, right? We can tell it's a string immediately by double quotes, and strings are completely different data types than Excel objects, right? So it's actually telling us the data type of this string, which is a string. In fact, if we give it any kind of string, for example, if I put in my first name here, we're going to get the exact same thing. As long as there's double quotes, it's a string, it's a data type used for representing text or characters, and we're going to get the exact same result. As a few more examples here, if I do something like TypeName workbooks, we're going to get a predictable result. We're going to get workbooks. We're actually going to get a different result, something a little bit unexpected when we do something like worksheets. What we're actually going to get here is sheets. So this actually has to do with a little bit of VBA internals. As it turns out, Excel actually supports two types of sheets. Worksheets, which are the ones that we're used to with all the data and the cells and the ranges on them, as well as chart sheets. Chart sheets are the ones where you can, for example, put an entire bar graph or pie chart on a separate tab or a separate sheet in the Excel interface. And chart sheets have their own sets of methods, of course, and properties. But worksheets are falling into this clump, into this bundle of sheets. Sheets is kind of the parent, and its two children include worksheets and chart sheets. So that's why this result may be a little bit unexpected. Let me provide you with 3 more examples to close this lesson off. As we should know by now from the Excel object model hierarchy, if I do something like this, workbooks 1, what are we going to get here? Well, we're not going to get workbooks. We're going to get a single workbook. Remember, because we're extracting from that collection. So TypeName can be really helpful. If you forget something like that, just feed in a valid object here and it'll tell you the right answer. Similarly, if I do TypeName right here and I start with my worksheets collection and I extract, let's say, the first worksheet from there, we're going to get worksheet. Finally, last example, TypeName. Let's give it a valid range object like the range of cell C3. Close this off with double parentheses. We're going to get a range. Again, it's a little bit underwhelming now, but hopefully you can start to see the application of this when we proceed a little bit further in the course. Whenever we have some kind of dynamic object whose value we cannot predict, if we're not going to know what kind of object it is in advance, we can use this method to tell us and then react to that. That's called conditional logic. Conditional logic means based on some kind of condition. If this condition is true, if it is a range object, do this. Or if this condition is true, for example, if it's an application object, do this. Right now we're just feeding plain Excel objects into it and we're getting kind of predictable results, but you should see the application of this as we proceed through the course, and we're also going to use it through some other examples in some upcoming lessons. So that's the TypeName method. Accepts an object, gives you back a string representing the type of that object.